The first time Markuschen heard those 5 words, he was standing in the ruins of what had once been the most advanced research facility in the Terran outer colonies. Smoke still rose from the twisted metal that had been Laboratory Complex 7, where humanity's brightest minds had worked tirelessly to unlock the secrets of quantum consciousness transfer. Now it was nothing but debris and death, another casualty in the war between the Hegemony Alliance and the so-called inferior species they sought to eliminate. Marcus had been searching through the wreckage for survivors when he heard the voice, small, trembling, speaking in heavily accented Standard. He turned toward the sound and saw her, a child of perhaps 8 standard years, her blue-gray skin marked with the distinctive bioluminescent patterns of the Zephyrian species. Her large, dark eyes looked up at him from behind a piece of collapsed ceiling beam, and she spoke again. "Will you be my father?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here, in this place of death and destruction, surrounded by the bodies of both human and alien researchers who had been working together toward a better future, this child, this enemy, according to hegemony propaganda, was asking him to be her family. Markuschen was 34 years old, a decorated soldier in the Human Defense Corps, and a man who had seen more violence than any person should. He had fought the Alliance forces on 14 different worlds, had watched friends die, had killed enemies with his own hands. He had been shaped by loss, forged by conflict, and hardened by necessity. The man who stood in those ruins was not the same person who had enlisted 8 years earlier with dreams of exploring the galaxy. But, as he looked down at this small, frightened being, something fundamental shifted inside him. The child's parents, Dr. Zelani Vorthak and Dr. Myron Vorthak, both respected xenobiologists, lay dead 20 meters away, killed not by enemy fire but by the orbital bombardment that the hegemony had ordered on their own facility when they discovered that humans and aliens were collaborating on research that could benefit both species. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, kneeling down to the child's eye level. His voice was gentler than it had been in years. "Kira," she whispered. "Kira Vorthak. My parents said, they said humans were good people. They said if something happened, I should find a human and ask for help." Her bioluminescent markings flickered weakly, a sign of extreme distress in her species. Marcus had been taught that Zephyrians were cold, calculating beings incapable of genuine emotion. He had been told they were manipulative, using their appearance and apparent vulnerability to gain advantage over more noble species. But, looking at Kira, seeing the genuine fear and hope in her eyes, he realized how thoroughly he had been lied to. The Human Defense Corps would arrive soon to secure the area. They would find Kira, and she would disappear into one of the detention facilities that officially didn't exist. At best, she would spend her life as a prisoner. At worst, Marcus had heard rumors about what happened to alien children in hegemony custody. Those rumors kept him awake at night. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'll be your father." He didn't know it then, but those words would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately change the course of the war, reshape humanity's place in the galaxy, and prove that sometimes the greatest strength comes from admitting weakness. The extraction ship arrived 37 minutes later. By then, Marcus had hidden Kara in an emergency shelter beneath the facility's medical wing. He reported to his commanding officer that the facility was completely destroyed with no survivors, then spent the next 6 hours helping to catalog the destruction before the site was abandoned. That night, when the official teams had departed, Marcus returned. He found Kira exactly where he had left her, clutching a small device that projected holographic images of her parents. She had been crying, the faint trails of bioluminescent tears still glowed on her cheeks. "I thought you weren't coming back," she said. "I promised," Marcus replied. "And I keep my promises." He had prepared forged identification documents, stolen supplies, and mapped out a route to the border worlds where hegemony authority was weakest. It would be dangerous. Traveling with an alien child would mark them both as traitors if they were caught. But Marcus had made his choice. The journey to the frontier took 3 weeks. They traveled on cargo freighters, in smuggling compartments, and sometimes on foot across barren worlds where no authorities bothered to patrol. Marcus told anyone who asked that Kira was a human child with a rare genetic condition that caused skin discoloration and unusual growth patterns. The story was thin, but most freight operators cared more about payment than passenger manifests. During those 3 weeks, Marcus learned more about Zephyrian culture from an 8-year-old child than he had from 8 years of military briefings. He discovered that Zephyrians didn't just communicate with words, their bioluminescent patterns conveyed complex emotional and intellectual concepts. He learned that their apparent fragility was evolutionary adaptation. Their ancestors had survived on a world where physical strength meant consuming resources that were better used for mental development. Most importantly, he learned that everything the hegemony had told him about non-human intelligence was not just wrong, it was deliberately fabricated. "My mother used to say that intelligence is like water," Kira told him one night as they sheltered in an abandoned mining station. "It finds its own shape in whatever container holds it." Human intelligence, Zephyrian intelligence, Krolic intelligence, they're all just different containers, but the water is the same. "Your mother sounds like she was very wise," Marcus said. Kira's markings flickered in what he had learned was equivalent to a sad smile. She said humans were the first species to understand that. That's why she wanted to work with human scientists. She said maybe together we could find new containers for the water. That conversation haunted Marcus for days afterward. Dr. Zelani Vordak had died believing that humans and her people could work together, could build something better than what either species could achieve alone. Instead, they had all been killed by the very humans she had trusted. When they finally reached Epsilon Station, a barely habitable world on the galaxy's rim where multiple species had established an unofficial neutral zone, Marcus faced the hardest decision of his life. He could leave Kira with one of the Zephyrian families that had taken refuge there. She would be safe, surrounded by her own people, able to grow up in a culture that understood her needs and abilities. Or he could keep his promise. "I want to stay with you," Kira said when he explained her options. "You're my father now. That means we're family." The concept of chosen family was apparently universal among thinking species. Marcus realized that in trying to save this one child, he had been saved in return. The angry, broken soldier who had knelt in those ruins 3 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by someone who had found purpose beyond destruction. They settled in the outer regions of Epsilon Station, in a district where humans, Zephyrians, Krolics, and a dozen other species lived in the kind of harmony that the hegemony insisted was impossible. Marcus used his military skills to work as a security consultant, while Kira attended one of the multi-species schools that had emerged in the neutral zones. For 6 months, they lived something approaching a normal life. Marcus learned to cook Zephyrian cuisine, studied his daughter's language and customs, and slowly began to understand how much of his own humanity he had lost during his years as a soldier. Kira thrived in the diverse environment, making friends among children of multiple species and excelling in her studies. It was during this peaceful period that Marcus began to understand the true scope of what the hegemony was doing. The war wasn't about resources or territory, it was about maintaining a lie. The lie that humans were somehow superior to other intelligent species, that cooperation was weakness, that diversity was a threat to be eliminated rather than a strength to be celebrated. The hegemony maintained power by keeping humanity isolated, afraid, and convinced that they were surrounded by enemies. But Marcus had seen the truth. He had lived among aliens and found them to be people different from humans in some ways, similar in others, but fundamentally deserving of the same rights, respect, and opportunities that any thinking being should have. The revelation that would change everything came when Kira brought home a school project. She had been assigned to research her family history, and, with Marcus's help, she had accessed archived records from the destroyed research facility where her parents had worked. What they discovered in those files would eventually bring down the entire hegemony power structure. Dr. Zelani and Dr. Myron Vordak hadn't just been studying quantum consciousness transfer, they had achieved it. Along with their human colleagues, they had developed a technology that could allow any intelligent being to temporarily experience consciousness from another species' perspective. A human could experience the world through Zephyrian senses, understanding their unique perception of electromagnetic fields and their complex emotional states. A Zephyrian could experience human kinesthetic intelligence and pattern recognition abilities. The implications were staggering. Such technology could eliminate the misunderstandings and prejudices that fueled interspecies conflict. It could allow different species to work together with unprecedented efficiency. It could reshape galactic civilization in ways that would benefit everyone. And the hegemony had destroyed it, along with everyone who knew how to recreate it, because it threatened their narrative of human supremacy. They killed my parents to stop this, Kira said quietly, her markings flickering with patterns that Marcus had learned indicated deep anger. They killed everyone to keep people from understanding each other. Marcus stared at the research data, feeling a cold rage building in his chest. This wasn't just about one destroyed facility or one murdered research team. This was about the systematic suppression of knowledge that could have prevented decades of war and suffering. But they had the data. Hidden in Kara's family archives, stored in formats that the hegemony's hasty destruction had missed, was enough information to recreate the consciousness transfer technology. They had the power to expose the lie that the entire war was built on. The question was what to do with that power. Marcus looked at his daughter, because that's what she had become, truly and completely, and saw in her eyes the same determination that had driven her parents to risk everything for their research. She was 8 years old, but she understood the weight of what they had discovered. "What would your parents want us to do?" he asked. Kara was quiet for a long time, her bioluminescent patterns shifting through complex configurations that Marcus was only beginning to understand. Finally, she spoke. "They would want us to finish their work. They would want everyone to have what we have." "What do we have?" "A family that shows people how to love each other even when they're different." In that moment, Marcus Chen, former soldier, accidental father, and reluctant revolutionary, made the decision that would ultimately end the war. They would not only recreate the consciousness transfer technology, they would use it to build something even more powerful, proof that the future the hegemony feared was not only possible, but better than anything they could offer. The man who had been shaped by loss and hardened by conflict was about to discover that sometimes the greatest strength comes from embracing what makes you vulnerable. And, sometimes, changing the galaxy starts with one small question from a frightened child. Part 2, The Man Who Destroys His Weak Self. The transformation of Marcus Chen from soldier to father to revolutionary was not a gentle process. It required him to confront every assumption he had built his adult life upon, to acknowledge the complicity of his past actions, and to rebuild his identity from the ground up. This reconstruction would prove to be the most difficult and most important battle he ever fought. 3 months after discovering the consciousness transfer research, Marcus and Kara had established contact with an underground network of scientists, activists, and refugees who were working to preserve knowledge and lives threatened by hegemony policies. The network called itself the Synthesis Collective, and its members came from dozens of different species united by the belief that cooperation was not only possible but essential for survival. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a human neurobiologist who had escaped hegemony persecution, became their primary contact within the collective. She had worked briefly with Kara's parents before the facility's destruction and understood the significance of the research they had recovered. "What you found could change everything," she told Marcus during their first clandestine meeting in the backroom of a multi-species cantina on Epsilon Station. "But recreating this technology won't be enough. We need to demonstrate its potential in a way that can't be suppressed or ignored." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "We need volunteers. People willing to undergo consciousness transfer to prove that the barriers between species are artificial constructs, not natural law. People willing to show that understanding truly is possible." Marcus felt his old soldier's instincts kick in, assess the threat, calculate the risks, protect what mattered most. The rational part of his mind immediately began cataloging all the ways this could go wrong. Experimental technology, unknown side effects, the possibility of permanent psychological damage. And, if they were caught, the consequences would be severe beyond imagination. But, then, he looked at Kara, who was sitting quietly in the corner with her bioluminescent patterns flickering in configurations he had learned meant she was thinking deeply about complex problems. "I want to do it," she said suddenly. "I want to try the consciousness transfer." "Absolutely not," Marcus replied immediately. "You're 8 years old. We don't know what this technology might do to a developing nervous system." "But, I'm already different," Kara protested. "I've been living with humans for months. I understand both perspectives. If the technology works with me, people will see that the differences between species aren't as big as they think. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward.
Actually, that raises an interesting point.
Cross-species adoption and cultural integration might provide unique insights into how consciousness transfer could work.
You've already been adapting to human social patterns while maintaining your Zephyrian identity.
Marcus felt the familiar cold grip of fear in his stomach. Everything protective in his nature rebelled against the idea of putting Kara at risk. But everything he had learned about being a father told him that sometimes protecting someone meant letting them face necessary dangers. "We'll need extensive testing first," he said finally. "Full psychological evaluations, neural mapping, safety protocols.
And, if there's any sign of risk to her, we stop immediately."
What Marcus didn't say out loud was that he had already decided to be the first test subject himself. If anyone was going to face the unknown risks of experimental consciousness transfer, it would be him.
The testing process took 6 weeks.
Dr. Vasquez assembled a team of researchers from multiple species, each contributing expertise in neurobiology, consciousness studies, and cross-species psychology. They worked in hidden laboratories, constantly moving to avoid hegemony patrols that were intensifying their searches for terrorist activities in the neutral zones. Marcus underwent psychological evaluation that forced him to confront aspects of his identity he had never examined.
Dr.
Varkan, a Krolik psychologist whose species specialized in understanding memory and identity formation, conducted sessions that were more challenging than any battlefield Marcus had ever faced. "You carry significant trauma from your military service," Dr. Varkan observed during one session, his crest fluttering in patterns that indicated careful analysis. "But, more importantly, you carry guilt about actions you took before you understood their true context." "I killed people," Marcus said bluntly. "I followed orders that I thought were protecting humanity, but they were just maintaining a lie."
"And now you seek to atone by risking your own life for this experiment?"
"I seek to prevent others from making the same mistakes I made." Dr. Varkan's crest shifted to what Marcus had learned indicated respectful disagreement. Atonement is not achieved through self-destruction. It is achieved through construction of better alternatives. The man who destroys his weak self does so not to punish that weakness, but to make room for strength. The phrase stuck with Marcus. Over the following weeks, as he prepared for the consciousness transfer experiment, he began to understand what Dr. Varkan meant. His weak self wasn't the soldier who had followed orders, it was the person who had accepted simple answers to complex questions, who had chosen certainty over truth, who had built his identity around being strong rather than being right. Destroying that version of himself didn't require punishment or self-flagellation. It required the courage to admit he had been wrong, the wisdom to learn from others, and the strength to rebuild his understanding of the world from a foundation of humility rather than pride. The first consciousness transfer experiment took place in a converted cargo container deep in the industrial sector of Epsilon Station. The laboratory was crude by research facility standards, but Dr. Vasquez and her team had managed to recreate the essential components of the technology from Kara's parents' research.
Marcus lay on a modified medical scanner while neural interface equipment mapped the electrical patterns of his brain. Across the room, Dr. Vasquez's research partner, a Zephyrian scientist named Dr. Keshvalani, underwent the same process. "Remember," Dr. Vasquez said, "this is just a 5-minute transfer. We're looking for basic cognitive function and emotional stability. Don't try to process everything you experience, just let it happen." The transfer itself felt like falling into someone else's dream.
One moment Marcus was looking at the familiar gray walls of the laboratory, feeling the weight of his human body and the steady rhythm of his human heartbeat. The next moment, the world exploded into patterns of electromagnetic sensation he had never imagined possible. Through Dr. Villani's consciousness, Marcus experienced the world as Zephyrians did, a rich tapestry of electromagnetic fields that revealed the emotional states, health conditions, and even recent experiences of every living being nearby.
The crude metal walls of the laboratory were revealed to be complex structures humming with electrical activity.
The other researchers in the room appeared as brilliant patterns of neural activity that told stories about their thoughts and feelings that words could never convey. But, more than the sensory experience, Marcus felt Dr. Villani's memories and emotions. He experienced the scientist's love for his research, his grief for colleagues killed in the facility destruction, his hope that this experiment might prevent future tragedies. He felt the deep loneliness of exile from his homeworld, and the gradual building of new community among the refugee scientists. When the transfer ended and Marcus returned to his own consciousness, he lay still for several minutes, overwhelmed by what he had experienced. The world looked different now, flat and muted compared to the rich electromagnetic landscape he had briefly inhabited. But, more importantly, he understood something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself.
Intelligence wasn't just a human trait that other species happened to share.
It was a universal principle that manifested differently in different biological and cultural contexts. Dr. Villani's thoughts weren't alien thoughts, they were simply thoughts expressed in a different language of consciousness.
"How do you feel?" Dr. Vasquez asked.
Marcus sat up slowly, looking around the laboratory with new eyes.
"Like I've been colorblind my whole life and just learned there are parts of the spectrum I couldn't see."
The implications of what they had achieved became clear over the following days as other volunteers underwent consciousness transfer experiments.
Each transfer revealed new aspects of the rich diversity of conscious experience that existed throughout the galaxy.
A human experiencing Crowley consciousness discovered cognitive approaches to memory and pattern recognition that revolutionized their understanding of learning. A Zephyrian experiencing human consciousness gained insights into kinesthetic intelligence and three-dimensional spatial reasoning that opened new possibilities for engineering and art. But, perhaps most importantly, every person who underwent consciousness transfer came away with the absolute certainty that the other species they had experienced were people. Not alien intelligence, not strange mimicry of consciousness, but genuine people with their own hopes, fears, dreams, and capacity for love. The technology worked exactly as Kira's parents had envisioned. It didn't eliminate differences between species, it revealed that those differences were sources of strength rather than division. It proved that cooperation and understanding were not only possible but inevitable once the artificial barriers of fear and prejudice were removed. Marcus watched Kira undergo her first consciousness transfer 3 weeks after his own initial experiment. The safety protocols had been refined, the technology improved, and her young neuroplasticity actually made the process easier and safer than it was for adults. She transferred with a young human researcher named David Kim, and the results were extraordinary. "It's like having a brother in another room of the same house," she told Marcus afterward.
"Different space, different view, but same home."
The poetic accuracy of her description captured something that months of technical analysis had struggled to explain.
Consciousness transfer didn't merge minds or eliminate individual identity, it revealed the fundamental unity underlying apparent diversity.
Word of their success began to spread through the underground networks. Scientists, refugees, and resistance fighters from across the galaxy began to seek them out, wanting to experience the consciousness transfer for themselves. Each new volunteer strengthened the evidence that cooperation between species was not only possible but natural. But Marcus knew that proof alone would not be enough to challenge the hegemony's power. They needed a way to share this knowledge with the broader galaxy, and they needed to do it in a way that could not be suppressed or distorted. The answer came from an unexpected source: entertainment media. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, was a human filmmaker who had been documenting life in the neutral zones. Her work had gained significant underground following throughout hegemony space, distributed through networks that the authorities struggled to control. "People don't change their minds because of academic papers," she told the research team during a planning meeting.
"They change their minds because of stories. You've created the technology to let people experience other perspectives directly. Let me show the galaxy what that looks like." The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity. Dr. Chen would create a documentary following several volunteers through the consciousness transfer process, showing not just the technical aspects but the human and alien stories behind the science. They would document the transformation that occurred when beings truly experienced life from another species' perspective. Most importantly, they would show Marcus and Kira's story, the human soldier and the alien child who had become family, proving that love and understanding could bridge any difference. "This is extremely dangerous," Dr. Vasquez warned. "Once this documentary is released, there will be no hiding anymore. The hegemony will do everything in their power to stop us.
Marcus looked at his daughter, now 9 years old and wiser than most adults he had known. Her bioluminescent patterns flickered in the configuration he had learned meant determined agreement.
Good, Kara said. Hiding is what they want us to do. My parents didn't hide when they thought they could help people. We shouldn't either.
Marcus realized that his daughter had just articulated the fundamental truth that had taken him months to understand.
The weak self hides from difficult truths and uncomfortable realities. The strong self faces them, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Then, we do this properly, he said. We tell the whole truth, accept the consequences, and trust that people are better than their leaders think they are. The production of the documentary took 4 months.
Dr. Chen and her small crew followed the consciousness transfer experiments, conducting interviews with volunteers, documenting the scientific process, and capturing the profound emotional reactions that occurred when beings experienced genuine understanding of other species. The centerpiece of the documentary was a sequence showing Marcus and Kira each transferring consciousness with volunteers from multiple species. The footage showed not just the technical process, but the expressions of wonder, recognition, and profound emotional connection that resulted from each transfer. What you're seeing, Marcus said in his interview, is the discovery that everything we were told about the impossibility of interspecies cooperation was a lie. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, a deliberate fabrication designed to keep us afraid and isolated. The documentary concluded with footage of the diverse community that had emerged around the research project. Humans, Zephyrians, Krolix, and members of a dozen other species working together, raising children together, creating art and music and literature that drew from the combined wisdom of multiple civilizations. This is what they're afraid of, Kira said in her closing interview, her young voice clear and certain. They're afraid that if we stop being enemies, we might become family. The documentary was titled The Question That Changed Everything, and its release through underground networks created the chain reaction that Marcus and his team had hoped for. Within days, it was being viewed throughout hegemony space, often in secret gatherings where people of multiple species watched together. The response was immediate and dramatic. In some sectors, hegemony authorities cracked down with increased violence, desperate to suppress the spreading knowledge that their entire power structure was based on lies. But, in others, the documentary sparked open rebellion as previously isolated communities began reaching out to each other across species lines. The war that had defined galactic politics for a generation was beginning to transform into something entirely different, not a conflict between species, but a struggle between those who promoted fear and those who embraced understanding. Marcus Chen, the man who had once followed orders without question, had become the father of a revolution built on love rather than hatred. But the real transformation wasn't in his role in galactic politics, it was in his understanding of what it meant to be strong. True strength, he had learned, came not from the ability to destroy enemies, but from the courage to transform them into family. Part 3, The Revolution of Understanding. The release of The Question That Changed Everything created effects that rippled across the galaxy faster than any military campaign could have spread. Within 6 months, the documentary had been translated into 47 languages and adapted for sensory formats compatible with non-human neural systems. More importantly, it had inspired the establishment of consciousness transfer facilities on 16 different worlds, each one proving again and again that understanding between species was not just possible, it was inevitable once the barriers of fear and propaganda were removed. The hegemony's response was swift and brutal. Emergency powers were declared throughout human space, communication with alien species was declared an act of treason, and military resources were redirected from frontier conflicts to internal enforcement. But these measures only accelerated the collapse of the authority they were meant to preserve. Marcus Chen found himself in the strange position of being simultaneously one of the galaxy's most wanted fugitives and one of its most celebrated heroes. The underground networks that had once moved refugees and supplies now moved consciousness transfer equipment, allowing the technology to spread to worlds where direct contact with the research team was impossible. It's beyond what we ever imagined, Dr. Vasquez told Marcus during one of their increasingly rare secure communications. We have reports of spontaneous consciousness transfer experiments on 43 worlds. The knowledge is propagating faster than any authority can suppress it. But, the true measure of their success wasn't in the number of facilities or the technical spread of the technology, it was in the stories that began emerging from worlds throughout the galaxy. On Kepler-7, a human mining colony that had been at war with the indigenous Telmiran people for 30 years, consciousness transfer experiments led to the discovery that the conflicts had been based on systematic mistranslation of communication attempts. The Telmiran had never been hostile, they had been trying to warn the human colonists about unstable geological conditions that threatened both populations. Within weeks of establishing communication through consciousness transfer, the two species were working together to develop safer mining techniques that benefited both communities. On Rigel Station, a trade hub where multiple species had maintained uneasy coexistence, consciousness transfer technology led to the emergence of new forms of art and music that incorporated the sensory capabilities of different species. Zephyrian electromagnetic perception, human kinesthetic intelligence, and Krolic memory architecture combined to create aesthetic experiences that no single species could have achieved alone. Perhaps most remarkably, on Earth itself, secret consciousness transfer facilities began operating in major cities. Human volunteers who experienced alien consciousness returned to their communities with unshakable conviction that the war was based on lies. Military recruitment plummeted, while desertion rates soared as soldiers refused to fight against people they had learned to recognize as family. Marcus watched these developments from the hidden research station that had become the unofficial headquarters of what media were calling the synthesis revolution. But, his attention was increasingly focused on a more personal project that had emerged from the global transformation. Kira, now 10 years old, had been working with Dr. Vasquez's team to develop what she called permanent synthesis, a modification of consciousness transfer technology that would allow multiple species to maintain constant low-level connection while preserving individual identity and autonomy. It's like the difference between visiting someone's house and living in the same neighborhood, she explained to Marcus. Instead of temporarily experiencing another perspective, we can learn to always be aware of other ways of seeing. The implications were staggering. If successful, permanent synthesis could eliminate not just the barriers between species, but the psychological mechanisms that allowed any form of prejudice or discrimination to flourish. It could create a galaxy where diversity was not just tolerated but genuinely celebrated as a source of strength. But the technology also represented unprecedented risk. Permanent neural modification could have effects that wouldn't become apparent for years or decades. The volunteers would be pioneers in the truest sense, venturing into completely unknown territories of consciousness. I want to be first, Kira told the research team. This is what my parents were working toward. They would want me to help finish what they started. Marcus felt the familiar protective instincts rise in his chest, but he had learned to recognize them as symptoms of his old weakness rather than signs of strength. His daughter was no longer the frightened 8-year-old who had asked him to be her father in the ruins of a research facility. She had become a person in her own right, with her own wisdom and her own choices to make. We do this together, he said. If you're going to be a pioneer, you won't be alone. The permanent synthesis procedure took place in the same converted cargo container where the first consciousness transfer experiments had been conducted, but the laboratory had been transformed by months of improvements and refinements. Representatives from 12 different species had contributed to the development of the technology, and volunteers from 8 species had agreed to participate in the initial group synthesis. Marcus and Kara were joined by Dr. Vasquez, Dr. Volani, 2 Krolic researchers, a human engineer named Sarah Martinez, and individuals from 3 species that had only recently made contact with the broader galactic community. Together, they would attempt to create the first permanent multi-species synthesis group. The procedure itself was surprisingly gentle. Unlike the dramatic sensory shifts of temporary consciousness transfer, permanent synthesis felt like gradually opening windows in a house that had always been dark. One by one, Marcus became aware of additional layers of reality that he had never known existed. Through the Krolic consciousness, he gained access to memory architectures that allowed him to maintain perfect recall of millions of individual experiences while simultaneously recognizing the patterns that connected them across time. Through the Zephyrian synthesis, he could perceive the electromagnetic signatures that revealed the emotional and mental states of every living being in the area. Through species he was only beginning to understand, he discovered forms of consciousness that processed reality in ways that human language had no words to describe. But, most remarkably, he remained fully himself. The synthesis didn't diminish his human identity, it placed it in a broader context that revealed its unique value and contribution to the collective understanding.
It's like being part of a symphony, Kira said when the procedure was complete.
Her bioluminescent patterns were shifting through complex configurations that Marcus could now understand represented the synthesis of multiple emotional and intellectual states. Each person is still playing their own instrument, but we can hear the whole song now. The permanent synthesis group became the nucleus of what would eventually be known as the new collective, not a political organization or military force, but a growing community of beings who had chosen to experience reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously. They established research stations, educational facilities, and diplomatic centers throughout the galaxy, always focused on the principle that diversity of thought and experience was the most valuable resource any civilization could possess.
The hegemony's final attempt to suppress the synthesis revolution came 2 years after the documentary's release.
A massive military fleet, representing the combined forces of the most hardline human factions, launched what they called Operation Purification, a campaign to destroy every consciousness transfer facility and eliminate all beings who had undergone the procedure. But, the nature of warfare had changed fundamentally. The synthesis communities had no military forces in the traditional sense, but they had something more powerful: perfect communication and understanding between species that had previously been enemies. When hegemony forces arrived at target worlds, they found not alien enemies to fight, but human, Zephyrian, Krolic, and other species working together so seamlessly that the supposed boundaries between them became meaningless. More importantly, many of the hegemony military forces had been infiltrated by synthesis volunteers, soldiers who had undergone consciousness transfer and could no longer bring themselves to fight against people they understood to be family. Operation Purification collapsed not through military defeat, but through mass desertion as soldiers chose understanding over hatred. The formal end of the war came not with a treaty or surrender, but with a question. Admiral Sarah Morrison, commanding officer of the hegemony fleet, requested permission to undergo consciousness transfer with a volunteer from the target world she had been ordered to destroy. Marcus, now recognized as one of the primary architects of the synthesis revolution, served as mediator for the session. He watched as Admiral Morrison, a career military officer who had spent her life believing in human superiority, experienced consciousness from the perspective of Dr. Talvorthan, a Zephyrian scientist whose research had been destroyed in one of the Admiral's previous campaigns. When the transfer ended, Admiral Morrison sat in silence for nearly an hour. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "They're people. They're all people.
How did I not see that they're people?"
"Because you were taught not to see it," Marcus replied.
"But, now you know. What matters is what you do with that knowledge." Admiral Morrison's response became the template for the transformation of the entire hegemony military structure.
Rather than dismantling the human defense forces, the synthesis communities integrated them into a new galactic security organization focused on protecting the growing networks of cooperation rather than maintaining artificial boundaries between species.
The process wasn't without challenges.
3 generations of propaganda and conditioning couldn't be overcome instantly, and some individuals and communities chose to maintain isolation rather than embrace synthesis.
The new collective's response was to respect these choices while ensuring that isolation remained voluntary rather than enforced.
Marcus found himself serving as an ambassador and educator, traveling throughout the galaxy to help establish new synthesis communities and mediate conflicts that arose during the transition period. But his most important role remained the one that had started everything, being Kara's father. Now 12 years old, Kara had become one of the most effective communicators of synthesis principles, able to explain complex philosophical and technological concepts in terms that children and adults of any species could understand.
Her unique perspective, having lived as both a Zephyrian exile and a human daughter, made her an ideal bridge between different ways of understanding reality.
"People always ask me if I'm human or Zephyrian," she told an audience at a synthesis conference on New Geneva Station.
"But that's the wrong question. The right question is, what can I contribute to our family?"
Marcus watched his daughter speak with pride that went beyond mere paternal satisfaction. She had become living proof that the future the hegemony had feared was not only possible but beautiful. The child who had asked him to be her father in the ruins of a destroyed laboratory had grown into a person who could help entire civilizations understand what family really meant. The final entry in Marcus Chen's personal archive, recorded 5 years after the end of the war, reflected on the transformation that had begun with one small question: "The man I was when I first heard Kira ask, 'Will you be my father?' was strong in all the wrong ways. I could fight, I could kill, I could follow orders without question. I thought strength meant being harder than whatever threatened me. But real strength, I've learned, means being soft enough to let love change you. It means being brave enough to admit when everything you believed was wrong. It means choosing to build bridges instead of walls, even when building bridges makes you vulnerable to people who still prefer walls." The synthesis revolution didn't succeed because we were stronger than our enemies. It succeeded because we learned that our enemies were never enemies at all, they were just family members we hadn't met yet. And, sometimes, changing the galaxy starts with one small question from a frightened child. The question isn't really, "Will you be my father?" The question is, "Will you love me enough to let loving me change who you are?" The answer, for anyone willing to be truly strong, is always yes. The document concludes with a holographic image: Marcus Chen, now in his early 40s, standing with Kira and a group that includes humans, Zephyrians, Krolix, and representatives from species that had been first contacted through synthesis networks. They are standing in what was once Laboratory Complex 7, now rebuilt as the Vorthak Memorial Research Center, where scientists from throughout the galaxy work together to explore new frontiers of consciousness and cooperation. The bioluminescent patterns on Kara's skin glow in configurations that express joy, love, and hope for the future. Marcus's expression shows the quiet satisfaction of a man who found strength not through conquering enemies, but through transforming them into family. In the background, visible through the laboratory's transparent walls, ships from dozens of worlds dock at the same station, their crews working together with the unconscious cooperation that had once seemed impossible but now seemed as natural as breathing. The galaxy had learned to ask the right question. And, in answering it, they had discovered that the space between species had never been emptiness waiting to be conquered, it had always been room for a bigger family.